corporate governance, and I think it's something that we have to continue to promote across the Caribbean region. I also want to encourage and continue to encourage your active participation in this session, because I think our collective learning will be the benefit of this exercise. So to kick things off, I would ask my co-host Denise to summarize what in her background prepares her for this type of discussion. Denise?
Thank you very much, Oliver. And that is a hard question. You're asking me what prepares me for delivering or being part of this conversation. And I want to say that 40 years of experience in communication, corporate communication, helps me to be here. My career as a communications practitioner ensured that I spent a lot of time communicating on behalf of both stakeholders, of both the board and the executive, to various stakeholders. And that is a difficult task to do, because the decisions that are made in the boardroom then have to be translated and communicated to people who are not in the boardroom. And invariably, not invariably, but oftentimes, you would have a board member saying, well, that is not exactly what we thought, you know. And then I would have to say, well, you know, you approved the communication before it went out. So, you know, so it is a challenging thing. In my experience, I was part of the consultancy team when 705 persons who were employed at BWE were sent home. And that is, I had a lot of learning there. So that is one of the things that prepared me. I've served on the board of United Way, which is an NGO. And again, the NGO perspective is different because the stakeholder expectations are also different. And since the NGO is relying on the generosity of some of your supporters, then your positioning has to be slightly different and has to be accommodating towards your stakeholders. I've served as the chair of Caribbean Games 2009, which was canceled because of the H1N1 virus. I've served as the former chairman, as the chairman of TDC, which no longer exists, as the chairman of TTHTI, which also no longer exists. And you may be thinking, but wait, everything you serve on no longer exists? Well, and I have been a director of family businesses. So I think that I have a wealth of experience and I just love the opportunity to share it. So having asked me that hard question, Oliver, I'm going to ask you that hard question. What in your background prepares you to participate in this conversation?
Sure, thanks, Denise. Spent 30 years working across Canada and the Caribbean. Different roles, including partner at Pricewaterhouse in charge of the advisory practice. Many people will be familiar with CLICO. I was judicial manager for CLICO for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, appointed by the court. I was also managing director and country head for First Caribbean, with responsibility for Barbados, EC, and Belize. So worked quite extensively across the financial services sector. Retired last summer. Now really serving on boards. Primary board is chairman of the Financial Services Commission for Barbados, which is the regulatory agency for the non-banking sector. And we cover insurance companies, credit unions, pension plans, etc. And most recently, fintech. I'm also chairman of the audit committee for University of West Indies for my sins, and that one keeps me quite busy, given all the challenges that we face across the region with UE. I'm also director on a number of private sector boards, and also being chairman and director on a number of state-owned entities in Barbados. And I've also been CEO of a state-owned entity as well. So I've a range of experience both from a management perspective and from a board perspective, and certainly look forward to the conversation today.
Yes, Oliver, and if we can go right into some of the lessons. And when Oliver and I were preparing this presentation, we asked ourselves, what is a big lesson? And one of the things we came up with is the implications of being a state entity board versus a private sector board. What are some of those distinctions that come to your mind, Oliver?
Well, as you said, they're quite different. In my experience, the political influence is obviously a huge differentiator. I've been on a number of boards where, ministers give instructions, some explicitly, some not so explicitly. And there's always a challenge being a board member and trying to manage through that process. We've had situations where ministers make commitments on behalf of the organization, and then the invoice arrives. And obviously, as a board, we'd have to discuss how we manage a situation where the organization didn't commit these funds, but the minister who was responsible for the organization did. So, and as you can imagine, that could lead to some interesting discussions. So I think those are the kind of things that, certainly we see in the SOEs, and I'm sure there's similar experiences in Trinidad and across the region, where there's always that tug of war between the political dimension and trying to manage effectively. And that continues to be an area, I think, for us to continue that we have to continue to focus on in order to improve corporate governance in the SOEs.
Yeah. That's a very interesting comment that you've made about, for instance, an invoice turning up and the board did not expect it. And it brings to my mind that distinction between the role of the board versus the role of the executive. And I wonder, how could an invoice get to the board? Shouldn't that really be at the executive level?
It should be, but again, depending on the situation, some ministers feel that they have responsibility for the organization, so they can make commitments on behalf of the organization.
Yeah, and that's a challenge. My own experience with that, and my experience has been to just simply see, that this is what the minister has asked for, but to have the conversation that, okay, you are the minister, and I appreciate that. You did the appointment, and you have the ability to revoke the appointment. But if you continue to do that kind of thing, present an invoice that is outside of what we have talked about and so on, then what you're really doing is destroying the internal systems of the organization. And in one instance, when I made that comment, I got a kind of harsh response. But to me, we have to look at the distinction between those boundaries that we have to set, what the board has to do and what the executive has to do. And unless we maintain that, then we're going to be in trouble in the long term. What is your view?
No, I agree. And it's something that, we're now looking in Barbados at how do we improve the whole issue of corporate governance around SOEs. And to your point, it's really creating that kind of structure and processes around that, those kinds of things, so that you don't have situations where commitments are made outside of a formal process of approval by the board or by management. It really shouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to build on that, I've also had experience in SOEs where directors are appointed who don't have requisite skills. I mean, maybe it was somebody who ran someone's political campaign, and suddenly they're on the board of an important state agency. How do you manage that situation there where they may not have a financial background or business background? And, very nice person, but in terms of the skills, they don't have the skills to be an effective board member. And that is sometimes a challenge in some of the state entities, in my experience.
One of the things in Trinidad is that in some state entities, I've seen that the Articles of Association identify the qualifications for the board members. And in a few of them, we have been very strict and we have observed that. But in far too many, we have not. And, I think that we need to just probably relook at the legislation to be able to identify what are the minimum criteria that you need to be part of the board. Because if you have someone who has no experience in the area or no competencies that you could identify, then again, what's going to happen is you're going to destroy the organization. But Oliver, there's something I just wanted to ask. What do you think is the objective? What should be the focus of the private sector board versus the state sector board? What was that distinction?
Sorry, just to be clear, you said the objective.
When I say I should not have said objective, the focus. Okay, what's in my mind? Maybe I should tell you what's in my mind, and then you'll be able to answer differently. What's in my mind is that private sector organizations work because of a return on investment. And that is very sharp and that is very clear. Public sector organizations work for and I mean state organizations, they generally work on the basis of subvention, and there isn't such a sharp requirement, and the performance matrices are not as distinct. So just with that difference, what are the implications of that?
The implications are that taxpayers continue to fund many of these state-owned entities, which lose money continuously, and it's an issue that the Barbados government is grappling with now. We have, approximately 60 state-owned entities. Realistically, many of those entities could be consolidated or divested. That's actually an exercise that we will be pursuing. As you know, Barbados is in an IMF program, and one of the key areas of focus now is the whole reform and restructuring the SOEs. I will be actually working with government as of May 1st or May 2nd, I guess, in this space, and really looking at the whole range of SOEs and saying, well, which ones we really need, which ones can we keep, and the ones that we do keep have very clear guidance in terms of this is what the organization is set up to do, so that the board can then work towards discharging that mandate. Right now, it's very big. Many of these agencies, we wouldn't call names, but there's some agencies that they really serve no useful purpose, but they've just been there for many years. They cost the taxpayers millions of dollars a year. That's obviously not sustainable.
There's a view that because SOEs use taxpayer funding, that the expectations and the deliverables and the standard should be even higher than in the private sector, because when it's private sector, it's really an individual's money. That person is taking risk with their money. But when it's a state-owned enterprise, then you're working on public money, and you need a higher standard. You have a view on that?
I agree we should, but if you look at the reason why SOEs, or many SOEs, were set up, it was a way of avoiding some of the strict controls within central government. So many ministries set up these SOEs where the controls were a little bit different, shall we say, and it was easy for them to commit funds. So I think, we really have to really tighten the rein on these SOEs, otherwise we're going to continue to face this challenge of these entities costing millions of dollars a year for taxpayers.
And what would you say, because we're still talking about the implications of being a state entity versus a private sector, what would you say is your biggest lesson in that area?
I think the biggest lesson, we've touched on it, I think really one, the lack of clarity for many of these SOEs means there's no clear mandate. Why do we exist? As opposed to just spending money every year. The other thing we'll also touch on is that, again, you have many directors without the requisite skills, and that's something that needs to improve. And training is going to be critical part of reforming the SOEs and ensuring that there's appropriate training for directors. Not everyone may have the skills, we accept that, but it should be some type of training that allows directors at least achieve a minimum standard so that they can perform better in their roles as directors of these SOEs.
Well, I think that those are two excellent lessons that I hope our participants would take away. The whole issue of what is your why? Why are you existing? And if you do not have that why very clear, then you're not going to go anywhere. It begins with, and then traditionally we used to call that, there's Simon Sinek who talks about the why. But we used to talk about that as your vision, your mission, and then we go to your strategies and all of that. But the discussion of the why is so important. And I think you're in an excellent position, because you're now going to be assessing some of the Barbados SOEs, and you won't be popular when you determine, let's say you determine that 50 of them don't exist. I'm kidding.
I'm happy to Trinidad.
We welcome your knowledge and expertise, and I'm sure the region can use you.